Welcome back to Builders of the Broken Bazaar, another episode. And I'm your host, Dr. Tabish Zaman. Now today, let me start with something we very rarely hear when people talk about business and entrepreneurship here in Britain. Today, there are around 5.5 million small businesses in the UK, and they make up over 99% of all the businesses in the country. And together, they employ around 16 million people. That is nearly half of the private sector workforce. So when we talk about the British economy, we are mostly talking about small firms. But then there is another part of this story we rarely speak about. Across the UK today, around 1 in 5 small businesses, they are owned by someone born outside the country. In London, that figure rises to almost 40% of all businesses. Now let's have a think of that. But again, this is not just about London though. Nearly half of the businesses in one of the world's largest cities are being built by people who arrived here from somewhere else. You see it everywhere. A restaurant run by a family who took that risk years ago. A transport firm that started with 1 van and now employs 10 drivers. A clothing workshop, a convenience store, a construction company, and a small manufacturing unit. These businesses, they rarely appear in glossy entrepreneurship stories. But guess what? They are the ones who keep high streets alive. They create jobs, they anchor local economies, and they often do it very quietly without recognition. And many of the people building them, entrepreneurship was not simply a lifestyle choice for them. It was a response to labor markets that did not always open their doors easily, a response to barriers, and sometimes a response to necessity. So instead of waiting for opportunity, what they did, they built their own. And that is where the work of today's guest becomes so important. Because for more than 3 decades, Professor Monder Ram has been studying exactly how these businesses emerge, survive, and grow. He is a professor of small business and director of the Center for Research in Ethnic Minority Entrepreneurship, CREME, the acronym, at Aston Business School, one of the leading research centers in the world dedicated to understanding migrant and minority enterprise. And across his career, he's helped shape how we understand small firms, not as an isolated success stories, but as businesses deeply connected to communities, family network, labor markets, and regulation. And his research has shown that entrepreneurship does not happen in a vacuum. It happens inside systems, inside neighborhoods, and inside opportunity structures that can either support enterprise or make survival very, very hard. And over the past 30 years, his work has influenced academic research, public policy, and debates about real role that migrant-owned businesses play in the economy. And in recognition of his contribution to small businesses research, he was awarded an OBE. But what I appreciate most about his work is something very simple. It reminds us that entrepreneurship is not only about high-growth startups and tech. More often, it begins with people trying to build stability for their families, opportunity for their communities, and a foothold in an economy that didn't always make space for them. Now, these businesses, they may look small from the outside, but collectively they employ millions of people and keep neighborhoods, economies alive. So if we want to understand how local communities and economies actually function, not just how they are described, we have to understand these businesses and the people behind them. And that is exactly what Professor Monder Ram has spent a lifetime doing. So Professor Ram, what an honor to have you with us. Welcome to Builders of the Broken Bazaar.
Thank you very much, Tabish. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you today. Looking forward to our discussion.
Brilliant. So I've got a lot to ask you, a lot of questions coming your way. So let me begin. Again, having studied your work and having looked at your work very closely, one thing which really stands out in your journey, and again, I'm hoping you're comfortable talking about it, because your work didn't begin in academia. I mean, before all those fabulous research publications and contributions in this space, you had such a direct experience working in a family business, if I'm correct, supporting small businesses firms in Wolverhampton. So would you mind giving us a taste of what it was and how that shaped you?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's an important starting point. Because my entry journey into this area of work came through a mix, a combination of biography and curiosity. In many ways, I'm sort of embodiment of the immigrant journey. My parents arrived in the country in the late 1950s with very little, like their contemporaries at the time, that they came from very poor backgrounds. When they arrived, they had few or no networks, no access into the labour markets, and they found their way into 3D jobs, dirty, demanding and demeaning work. And that was a tale that wasn't exclusive to my parents. It was widespread. And they made their way. They made their way in foundries, in factories, and in dead-end jobs until they saw an opportunity to set up what was initially a grocery business before they gravitated to clothing. And I grew up in the grocery business and worked in it as a school kid. And I also worked in the family clothing business in my early days. And that was very formative in my experience. And that's the kind of world I knew. That's the kind of world my contemporaries operated in. And when I sort of dipped my toe into the academy and talking about my PhD, it was really interesting and disturbing at the same time. It was interesting to see how other people, through the written word, through policy discourse, viewed people like us. And so very much we were seen as corner shop owners, sweatshop owners, and just sort of people who set up dead-end businesses. And that was quite a shock to the system, because that didn't resonate with the way I saw what we were doing and the way my contemporaries were going about their business. We got very little of the sort of dynamics of what it's actually like starting such a business, working amongst family, amongst community, making your way through enterprise, spotting opportunities. The vitality, the tensions, the dynamism was just missing in this flat, homogenized account of businesses like ours. And we were portrayed as a peccadillo, as a curiosity, rather than, as you mentioned in your eloquent introduction, an integral feature of modern day economies.
Yeah.
So it was that sort of, I suppose, friction, frustration, which was provided the fuel to look at this even more. So it was that combination of my biographical experiences and an urgent academic curiosity, which really powered my interest in this area.
I was very lucky to have met you in person as well. Of course, reading through your papers, reading through your work, that real world experience. And again, given the discussion you have and what comes across, that real world experience seems to run through much of your research. Again, I don't want to really label migrant entrepreneurship as a discipline in itself, because it's such an interconnected space there. You have clearly shown through the work how do those early experiences shape some of the research questions you carried on pursuing as an academic, isn't it?
Yeah, sure. Let's take. I think you're right. I think you're right. One of the things I've always sort of fought against is this marginalization of marginalized communities, and it's sometimes almost sort of the default position is there's nothing to offer other than the sort of exceptionalism. And I think that is dangerous, because it taught others, the academy, and others policy making. It's a sort of common sense position. Here's the mainstream, where all the work and all the interest and all the importance is located, and there's the minorities. And how should we understand that? The benign interpretations are sort of that, well, let's look at them as some kind of exotic entities, or more damning verdicts would be they're just not consequential to the economy. And what I've tried to do is to say, look, there are distinctive features of operating in a minority businesses, but they are also integral to the economy as well. And I think we've tried to make that case. We've tried to say, look, we need to understand that, let's say, a very practical example, a small retail business, just operating with largely family community labor. Just because it has no formal employment doesn't mean there's not an employment relationship. Just because there isn't formal management practices doesn't mean that human resource management doesn't go on in that business. And just because there isn't a formal ladder of opportunity doesn't mean it's not a vehicle for social mobility. And, if you just take each of those points in turn, those are really quite profound. Let's just my discipline is industrial relations, human resource management. You quite rightly said in your opening remarks that small businesses, micro businesses, are something like 99% of the economy. Most micro businesses don't have formal management practices. Yet we have a whole discipline built on understanding enterprises with formal management practices. What does that do if it doesn't exclude? And so so that's why we've sort of really latched onto this concept of informality.
Yeah.
As a mainstream management concept, because we think if something's informal, it's not that serious. It's pre-serious. You informal, then you become formal, etc. No, it's embedded into any enterprise. What we need to understand is the degree of the informality, when it becomes important, when it's not important, how does it fit within different kinds of companies? It's essential to all organizations. It's not a peculiarity for minority businesses. And so one of the I suppose, agendas we have is to embed those as mainstream management concepts. And that's what we tried to do with debates on informality, for example. It's now understood as a mainstream management concept. If you want to look at how, for example, small firms interpret or work with regulations, for example, you need to understand informality and managerial discretion. And I think the work that we've tried to do has played its part in elaborating that understanding. So I think, as you said your introductory remarks, it's really important that that's why it's important to understand the lived experience. You get beneath the skin of what's going on in these companies.
Yeah. And I think people have taken... I think people have taken that lead, and people have taken the shown pathway in terms of the informality, and I can see some exciting work happening in this space as well. But I've got another question linked to this before we move on to the next one, which is again your perspective, given how much time you've spent in this space and how you've looked at it. Obviously, the world was completely different at that time. So when you began thinking about publishing your work, when you began thinking about writing about some of these concepts, did you feel that the academic world understood, and again I'm talking very specifically because we both share that relation in terms of the university, the higher education. Do you feel that world was actually looking at it from that reality? How much of a pushback you had at that time in terms of talking about some of these concepts?
Right, that's an interesting question. So I think if I sort of cast my back when we did the early publication when I started, when you're a PhD student, you think, well, what on earth can I contribute? And that's what I thought when I started my PhD, because I started my PhD on the subject of industrial relations in small firms. And almost at that time, there was a book published in 1989 called Industrial Relations in Small Firms. I thought, well, that's great. Someone's already done the subject I wanted to do. But really, that provided a focus for what I was doing, because that work highlighted some of the issues that we already talked about. Said industrial relations in small firms. It looked at the clothing sector, and it said, look, the clothing sector is subject to harsh market conditions. It's dominated by large firms. The small firms down in the supply chain, they just vehicles for management discretion. Workers have no say at all. Right. And I grew up in the clothing industry in the West Midlands. Most of my family in the clothing industry. And I thought, this just is not true. Not true. Because the kind of businesses that we were working in were supposed to be the most harshest of workplaces, sweatshops. Yeah, there was all sorts of fights going on in the business, all sorts of worker struggles, all sorts of acts of resistance. It's just no one to understand these businesses and work alongside. And so at this time, that became my quest to say, look, conceptually, how do we understand this? And that's when we come up with the sort of term negotiated paternalism, negotiation of order, as the core concept in understanding management in these firms. And what we mean by that is something very simple. If you want to get the best out of your workers, there's a limit to how much you can do that through harsh discipline. You need their active consent as well. And so in the shop floors that I looked at, the clothing machinists, they weren't a member of a trade union, but they got together to resist. I looked at my own business, my dad and other shop, and they negotiated a rate. So even though on the face of it, it seemed the conditions were harsh, actually, when you got to the skin, it was a real active negotiation. And they created their own space, their own acts of resistance, and they were able to negotiate in a really active way. And that became the focus of my book. And when I wrote way back in the early 90s, it was how can workers have a sense of agency when they're operating in harsh managerial conditions? And so when we framed it like that, it wasn't to do with ethnicity. Ethnicity was part of the story, not the story. It was as much to do with the conflict between labor and capital. And so in those early publications, that's what we tried to do. That was our contribution. That, look, these big concepts like conflict, contradiction, control have to be modified and understood in a particular way with these kinds of firms. And those were those were our initial contributions. That perhaps our most enduring contributions was to highlight the way these big concepts clash in a small firm. It's not through management and trade unions. It's through active negotiations, and it's very intricate, and it depends on the sector, depends on market conditions, labor market conditions. And I drew that all out in the early publications, which really complicated the picture that initial book was had articulated, complicated that story in a way that was way beyond ethnicity and was much more about the essence of working in a small firm.
And I think it's very much relevant even today, I feel. But your contribution did not stop there, Monder, in terms of what you have been doing as well. I think one of the things which is very important, given the popularity of entrepreneurship as a discipline as well, your work on mixed embeddedness, I mean, that is something which at least I picked up, in terms of what I read.
Yeah.
I think your work around that changed that conversation by showing how businesses, they're not shaped by, in terms of they're actually a part of the labor market, the regulation, the immigration. So you brought the whole ecosystem on the table, isn't it? It wasn't about individual ambition all alone.
Right. That's right. And mixed embeddedness, I have to say, is originated by Dutch academics Robert Kloosterman and Jan Rath. But we were really taken by it, and we've developed it. We've worked with it a lot. We've developed it, critiqued it, and extended it. We should say, at its heart, it means something very simple. It means that entrepreneurs are shaped by two things at once. On the one hand, there's community and family resources, like family, trust, and networks, shared knowledge. And that's what's often looked at. But on the other hand, there's the wider rules of the games, the regulations that we have to adhere to, the legal restrictions if you're a migrant of what you can do, labor market, finance, immigration policies, local opportunity structures. So we have to hold both together and look at them at the same time if we're going to adequately understand these businesses. But the problem was, at that time when Jan and Robert started looking at it, there was a dominance on looking at migrant entrepreneurs through cultural lenses and cultural perspectives alone. So they would look at the culture of an Asian business or the Asian community, and they would argue, for example, that Asians are more entrepreneurial than the Black community, etc., which was far too simple. It's much more complex. These businesses are always operating at the intersection of social dynamics and institutional processes, wider institutional processes. And that, I think, was a big contribution of Jan and Robert. And we've developed and extended that. And it was the big pushback against the dominance of the US and North American literature, which was started by Professor Ivan Light in the 1970s, and they talked about cultural and ethnic resources. They did really important work. We think they attached too much explanatory importance to the cultural element at the expense of the wider institutional processes. So one very concrete example, is that this notion that Asians are hardworking probably is the case. There was a study that looked at that brought all the communities together, African, Caribbean, Asian, etc., and they looked at working hours, and it did show that Asians had longer working hours in the main. But then, when you broke it down into the sector, they had longer working hours because they were in the retail sector. When you compared them with other communities in the retail sector, there was hardly any difference. And this was this study was before the sort of deregulation. So that study highlighted that what previously academics had attributed to culture was really a function of structure, because it was part of the way of surviving in the retail sector. And I think that's what mixed embeddedness brought to the fore. But again, as academics do, we need to evolve the concept, and that's why we critique some of its limitations.
Yeah. And there are, I mean, if you pick up journal articles now, and again, I'm sure you're so familiar with this, you see so many citations around that particular theory. But again, where do we see ourselves? And again, especially for young and upcoming scholars who are picking up this area or looking into these contexts, where should they go with mixed embeddedness? And what's the future in terms of looking at something like this, which has actually gone on for decades now? Where does it stand as far as, because your work has shown, in terms of whatever you've done with other pieces as well, its implication for the wider economic and policy environment. But it's not just about business succeeding or struggling.
Yeah.
So how do we take this from, passing it on to the next set of scholars who are interested in this kind of work?
So we met recently, didn't we, at a conference in Bremen?
Yes.
And I don't know what you thought, but I left that conference really quite inspired by the community there. What I saw there was a group of scholars, various stages in their career, lots of young scholars, as well as more established scholars from all over Europe. Quality of the debates and the discussions and the work that colleagues were doing was exceptional, was really interesting. There was a real passion for the subject, a real interest in how it connected with the political context, which we may or may not sort of move on to. And there was an urgency and a vibrancy. As you mentioned, I'm well into my fourth decade at this. This is really impressive. This is really impressive. And I felt really quite reassured by that and energized by that. And, you say, what next? And mixed embeddedness, etc. Well, lots of academics have done important work in evolving mixed embeddedness. There have been sort of thoroughgoing critiques of it, and we've contributed to that. As academics, we should do. But I think there's lots of scope to develop it even further. There's big developments on the right kind of ecosystems to facilitate entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
It's very noticeable that there have been very important contributions from scholars in our field who have critiqued the notion of ecosystems for its sort of neglect of inclusion and its reproduction of the processes of exclusion. What I think in terms of what comes next, I think what these critiques highlights, is the importance of power, importance of institutions, and the importance of place. We know a huge amount about entrepreneurial intentions and traits. We know less about how market support systems, intermediaries, procurement, and migrant regimes are sort of structured and how they shape outcomes. So I think there's a huge scope to do that. And there have been some really important contributions which have really challenged the field. So there's a paper by Gary Bruton and colleagues on the racialization of entrepreneurship research. And Angela Martin is wrote a paper in sociology on racial capitalism. And I think both of those papers are important contributions to then really inviting us to take a step back and focus on how the rules of the game are structured and in a way that disadvantage particular communities. And with AI, I think that's going to be equally, assume even more significant in our own centre. Now we're sort of looking at this topic. We've got colleagues looking at the role of AI in integration and at different levels. How can we make the most of this really transformative technology? You know, how can we use it in a practical and ethical way to promote integration, but also, you know, being very mindful that it is a source for inequality as well. So I think there's a huge scope to develop the subject even more. And I think that's the initial impulse of, you know, embedding it in wider debates and really not being marginalized is important. In some of the journals, there's been a real pushback against the notion of classifying, othering. In the big journals, ETP and Journal of Business Venturing, there's been a move to try and classify all minority communities as unconventional entrepreneurs, which I think is fraught with danger. And there was I was pleased that was a response paper in Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice led by Garcia, which pushed back against that and said, look, you know, actually, what you think is unconventional is the mainstream, you know.
Yeah.
And we need to really have a much more inclusive approach to entrepreneurship rather than excluding it by seeing people as unconventional and not I don't know.
Yeah, that's a dangerous line to take, isn't it? That's a dangerous line to take. And more importantly, I think as scholars, we've got a role to play as well in how we frame. And this is something which young scholars look at us or look at the work which likes of yourselves have done, which has been you know, rather ahead of its time as well, I would say. But I think your work continues. I know we touched upon this earlier. The theme around your work, you know, you spoke about the informality as well, and your work continues to set the trend that way. So in 2026, I believe your work, employment and society paper with your colleagues on Bangladeshi restaurants, that came up. Again, you spoke about how entrepreneurs, they adapt during crisis. I know we've moved from the labeling bit of it. I wanted to get a bit more into your work. Again, often developing those very practical steps to keep their businesses alive. So how about you share or you tell us about what that research actually showed when it came to these entrepreneurs surviving difficult conditions?
That was a fascinating study because we started that was about a four-year project and we looked at three sectors: Bangladeshi caterers, creatives from marginalized communities, and retailers from diverse communities. And we were looking at productivity in those businesses because no one looks at productivity in those businesses and what it means. And, you know, and we've written a number of papers from that project. The paper that you've mentioned has just come out in Work, Employment, Society, and it looks at the Bangladeshi community, in particular restaurant owners, and we did a series of case studies, and we followed them for about 2 or 3 years. But those 3 years are really very interesting years because when we started, it was just before COVID. And then COVID happened, and then the cost of living crisis, and there was huge issues about labour market challenges. So even before 2018, Bangladeshi catering sector was really under pressure because of immigration. We know about the toxic migration discourse, competition from other cuisines. And then we had COVID, and then the cost of living crisis. And COVID, the hospitality sector was one of the worst affected sectors. And, you know, so most restaurants suffered, but the Bangladeshi community suffered more because disproportionate number of Bangladeshis work in that sector. So I think there was one stat that said if you were a Bangladeshi, you were 20 times more likely to be working in a shut down sector, a sector that was completely shut down because of COVID. And so we looked at around, 20 odd case studies, and we followed them through that time. And you would have thought how that these businesses, again, this sort of stereotype of the businesses, small, unsophisticated, they would close, or they would be even more exploitative than they are paying, etc., etc. And what we found was fascinating, because we looked at them, we interviewed them 3 or 4 times. I think of the 20 odd businesses, only one or two closed down. And the others, there were 3 categories. There's categories that just got by mobilizing community ties. So there's 3 categories. Those that closed down, only 1 or 2. Those that got by mobilizing community ties and navigating. And we had another category that innovated. And that was really interesting, because that was the most counterintuitive finding. So the biggest categories are those that innovated. Right? They innovated. And what I found fascinating was, they said, oh, well, why don't you just use delivery apps, Deliveroo, etc.? Well, there's 30% commission charged by Uber and Deliveroo, etc. It was not an option open, but they innovated themselves. They supported each other. They got support from, it was an engaged scholarship project. They worked with us too. Innovation was really important, and informality was threaded throughout. So it was a strategic resource, right? It's quite a sophisticated strategic resource. It was not a compensatory mechanism. It was not compensation. It was active. And that's what we thought was really interesting, that when a set of businesses face common conditions, but they responded in really different ways. And I suppose the conceptual insight was, how come they responded in different ways? What were the factors? What were the mechanisms? And what we were able to unearth was people who used different kinds of agency, community, navigational, and innovation were the ones that were most successful. So it wasn't because they got in a management consultant or they invested in machinery. They were able to use their own resources in a quite sophisticated way. And for us, that is a really imaginative response. A really imaginative response. And that has implications for how we understand agency and informality. And it gets away from these sort of really limited debates of formal and informal firms, or sophistication and human capital, etc. It wasn't a sophisticated deployment of human capital or qualifications. It was really using a combination of skills and using the resources to best effect at a particular point in time. And it showed that the variation in response. And so you can't just understand the Bangladeshi catering sector in a flat way, in a unidimensional way. You have to look at it in all of its complexity. And when you do that, then you get a more sophisticated understanding of the eternal sociological question of the dynamics of structure and agency. And that's, I think, what we were able to show in that paper. And again, for us, we revisited a theme that we published on informality in that journal in the year 2000 as well. And that the debate has evolved. So it was good to be able to contribute to it again.
No, it's a fascinating paper that way. But again, coming back from it, do you think that's an indicator, that's a signal to some of the policymakers out there who misunderstand the informal practices? And I'd really encourage others to read this paper.
Well, thank you. I mean, as you know, the engagement with policy is a long-standing interest of ours, and we've done it for well over a couple of decades. Again, this stems from a frustration about the disconnect between what actually goes on and the qualities and the contributions and the dynamics of the businesses that we look at and the policy perspective. When we started down this journey, there was very stereotypical understanding of what an Asian business is, an African Caribbean business is. It was a very unsophisticated understanding of quite a sophisticated business community. And so that's why we took it upon ourselves to engage with policy. And lots of academics don't do that for valid reasons. We felt there was a huge amount of value to be gained by engaging with policymakers, practitioners, because there was I suppose, as academics, we want our work to matter, and getting your work to in front of policymakers is one way of doing that. But it's also a source of actually, for me, that's part of being a scholar, opening up opportunities and spaces, more spaces than communities have had in the past. So, so promoting, by telling the story of minority enterprises, or its complexity, you're helping to develop or improve conditions for those businesses.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is part of a scholar's responsibility as well, directly or indirectly. So that's been important to us. And we've had a long-standing engagement with different policymakers and practitioners. Part of it, it's that same impulse of respecting the lived reality of the businesses and the communities we work with. We don't say that there's a lack in these communities. We say there's a lack of understanding how these communities operate, and there's a big difference. There's a misclassification of how they operate. There's a huge amount of entrepreneurial talent and also challenges in these communities that is not recognized. And I think that's the message. If we're to fast forward now, we've touched upon the issue of contribution. Isn't minority business in the UK massive underestimate, but that's the best data we have, contributing 25 billion. That's the position now, but it could be 100 billion if we were to remove the barriers that they faced, if they were to grow at the same rate as their white counterparts. Our argument is that's the economic dividend, and there's a whole social contribution, but a large part of that deficit arises from a misunderstanding or a lack of appreciation of how these businesses actually work. So that's why the work that we do in the scholarly community is actually really important, because it's our job to tell that story and to tell it to different audiences. We can't just talk to ourselves.
Yeah.
We have to use those insights and get it into the sectors, the boardrooms, the decision makers who make the consequential decisions that will shape the fortunes of a huge swathe of the economy.
Yeah. And you've led the way, Monder, that way, and we are all learning from the process, your journey, your publications, your work, your, liaising with different agencies, the government, there's a blueprint for us there. And again, looking at how we evolve or how the work has evolved, you say understanding is so important. And across your studies, when I look at those papers, when I read through some of them, we spoke about informality. We spoke about, some of the pre-theories or some of those early framework. But again, what I see, there's a theme here where you're so strong on community, which you have argued is a key part of whatever business or however you look at success. So your research has shown us about, or spoken about, the family network, the community tie, the shared trust, which often is at the heart of these kinds of businesses. So give us a taste of how important you think the social network is in helping these businesses not just survive, but thrive in a community, in an environment like this.
They have always been of critical importance, and that continues today. In the early days, people fixated on that. Part of the importance of mixed embeddedness was that it corrected the undue emphasis on social networks. But even today, we shouldn't dismiss the importance of social networks. I still think they play an outsized role and a vital role, and we need to understand that better. There was a great book called The Migrant Paradox, published a few years ago, and it focused on 3 high streets in the UK, and we've used this book, and it was by Professor Suzanne Hall at the LSE. And what Suzanne did was an ethnography over a number of years, just interview everyone on that street, all the businesses on that street. And one of them was in Birmingham, the street I know well. And what it found is really quite astonishing. There were businesses that had been there. They're all supposed to be corner shops. They're not. They're professionals, civic institutions like temples. There's care agencies, and there's businesses that had been there for 3 or 4 generations. They spoke 40 odd languages for business reasons. They employed people from the community, but also outside of the community, from communities that have been excluded from the labour market. If you look at the rateable value, it was often in excess of what you'd get in city centre locations. And they're a huge asset. And the interesting thing was they had very little support from policymakers, practitioners. And to your point about the importance of social network, how did they survive? Well, she coined this term called the infrastructure of care. They had developed their own ways of supporting each other. So shops would be where you go to get forms filled in and signed. Your professionals would support the businesses informally. And so there were these whole microeconomies, she called them edge economies, that had developed, and they operated in a context of hostility, but they'd proved their worth economically, but also socially. And, there's a very concrete link to the way those businesses operate and the current interest in the everyday economy. Those firms, par excellence, are the examples of the everyday economy. They exist and they often thrive. One area in Birmingham that I'm very close to, and I observed quite a lot, Soho Road. For anyone in Birmingham, it's an iconic road. It's a road that sort of really provided a lifeline for the Asian community, the Black community, and it's evolving now. It's become very multi-ethnic. And there are about 400 businesses on that street. And, there's a whole discourse in the UK about the decline of the high streets. It's not declining. It's the opposite. It's thriving. It's very difficult to have the shops. There's no boarded up shops. It's thriving most times of the day. There were people from Dubai relocating those businesses in that area. Properties at a premium. That's a huge success. And that's not because of the support system. It's in spite. And it's a fascinating example of, I think it's a great example of inward investment. A lot of the businesses have come from other areas. It's a shopping destination for people outside of the country, other parts of the UK as well. And what's really interesting is I've got to know them really well. They've developed their own support system. They've set their own way of supporting the businesses, and it's really, there's a huge amount of engagement with it, and that stands in stark contrast with poor engagement in formal business support systems. And I think that works because it speaks to the lived reality of those businesses, and it's run by those businesses. It's just evolved because of those common interests of those businesses, because people have taken the time to understand and immerse themselves and become embedded in those communities.
Yeah. And it's working for them. But for us as scholars, what sort of responsibility we have to make sure those examples are out there and it is pushed away from the margins and becomes the central conversation, because it's not just about the economic success. Yeah, sorry.
No. I think your question of what responsibility we do have our scholars, I think that's a really vital question. And there are a variety of opinions. For some, not me, but I don't knock it. There's a very valid view that a scholar is a scholar. Their job is to elaborate theories and try to understand the world theoretically. The world, or the real world, is simply a laboratory to test out their ideas. And, that's typically how many of the journals operate, which is, what's your theoretical contribution? And that's important. I don't want to knock it. It is really important. And there's others, academics, who are sort of near consultants or activists, who say, oh, we need to do this, support this community. I can understand that dynamic as well. I suppose my concern with that way of thinking is you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Part part of, I suppose, the importance of scholarship is enables you with the facility to think deeply, become reasoned in looking at what will work and and there's a commitment to truth and objectivity as well, which doesn't sit well with a pure activist demeanor. But there is a different path, the path of engaged scholarship, which I think you can hold both together. And this is a philosophical question. And I think, if I'm subscribed to critical realism, and, if you look at that ontology, it does believe in truth, it does believe in objectivity, and it believes in developing really sound explanations of phenomena. But equally, it believes in using those explanations to make a difference.
Yeah.
And that's where I position myself. It's uncomfortable sometimes because journals aren't necessarily always keen on that.
Yeah.
And it's uncomfortable when you're in the activist community, when they want you to endorse a particular policy or strategy, and you say, you can't do that, or support a particular company. And I said, it's support generally, but not your company in particular. But then, that because we're not lobbyists, right? So, but that's the ground we've tried to hold at CREME, be the custodians, take scholarship seriously, but use it to enable, use it to facilitate, use it to convene, use it to encourage, but don't use it for marketing purposes.
Yes.
So be very, very attentive and sensitive to power dynamics.
Yeah.
So for us, that is a very challenging but generative space as well. You can have really interesting. A lot of our most interesting work has arisen because we found out we've started a project. Stuff has happened, and we've tried to make change, and it's been difficult. And you want to try to conceptualize why that difficulty has occurred and how do you get around it. A paper that we have published in Human Resource Management Journal, a decent journal, from the same data set, was about the responses of businesses during COVID. And we couldn't have anticipated how these firms would have responded, but they all engaged with business support in a different way, and we were able to understand why, what were the critical mechanisms. But you couldn't have done that from a distance.
True.
You would have lost an academic opportunity if you kept your distance. Yeah. And you'd also have lost that opportunity if you just became consultants. So that's what we try to occupy. It's not always easy.
I think that's
yeah.
No, I think that's a very important distinction. I mean, I love for you to finish your thought.
Yeah. No, as I said, for us, it's not an easy space to occupy. But one of the things that I've become really heartened is there's a huge amount of interest now in engagement, impact, and scholarship. And there's different ways to take it forward. We think we've developed a way that works. Our constant challenge is to get that debate accepted in scholarly circles as well as practical circles. And one of the things that sort of pleases me now, CREME so we've got a team of young scholars who are doing this every day, who are training themselves, so learning themselves by working in organizations about how to do this work. And they're doing good scholarly work, and they're making an impact from virtually day one of their PhD, because they're in organizations they have to get by. And that has been hugely rewarding to see. Since I moved to Aston about 4 or 5 years ago, we've had half a dozen PhDs in the system, and a lot of them have got through. And they've grown so much as people, scholars, obviously, but also people who are very adept and in working in different arenas, the scholarly arena and the practical arena. And that's so almost by default, we've developed this way. It's not been through giving a structured course on engaged scholarship. They've learned by doing and by sharing their experiences. And what I'm really pleased with is that the organizations we work with then don't normally engage with the university, then become switched on to the value of working with academics. And I think that because then that's what are you doing? You're opening up a sort of a sacred space, which is the university sector, to communities that have been excluded. We believe, you, me, Scott, we believe passionately in the role of universities. Problem is the opportunity is not available for all. And through our modest ways, we're trying to do that. And we've got more of us doing that with the younger scholars working in this particular way.
Yeah. And I think I want to talk about CREME in terms of how that has shaped and that has helped, your vision in terms of working with different groups as well. But before I go there, I've got this little discussion which I had to, and ever since I came across this paper which I find very interesting. And again, there's so many people involved on this work, but I want a few words from you when we talk about the heterogeneity in entrepreneurship, where you have spoken about the inclusive approach in how we look at all of this. I think this piece came out in ETP, I believe.
Yeah. It was multi-authored, and we all had our different perspective on it. And I think it's an important piece because it's a real statement that, we shouldn't define the domain of entrepreneurship too narrowly and in a way that replicates this iconic image of what an entrepreneur is that looks remarkably like someone operating in Silicon Valley or a tech bro. We've said, we need just different depictions, more inclusive depictions and categorizations, and different scholars have different views on how to do that. We think at CREME, in our approach, we think, understanding the context, really locating the phenomena in context is very important. Understanding where entrepreneurs fit in wider social society, the wider social system is of great importance. So heterogeneity is part of the condition. It's not simply about one kind of entrepreneur. And so I think that's why that piece is really important, because it's a response to those who want to put a really exclusive boundary around the domain of entrepreneurship.
Yeah. And that work, and again, along with the others, that has come through what you have started. So we're going to put on another hat now, looking away from, writing papers and the scholarly work. Yeah. Let's talk a bit about CREME, the Center for Research in Ethnic Minority Entrepreneurship. It basically helped you build a major hub. You've connected academics, you've connected policymakers, communities, of course. So give us, in terms of your motivation to establish something like this.
Do you know, CREME, I've been working in this space since the late 1980s, but CREME wasn't established until 2004. Mm-hmm. When I was working in Leicester, and had been approached constantly by the universities I was in to set up a centre, on ethnic minority entrepreneurship, and I resisted for two reasons. I thought, first of all, the whole notion of setting up a centre, you don't need a centre to make an impact, right? Your work, even now, I think the work should be the impact, not the label, right? So I resisted for that reason. And frankly, I didn't want to be pigeonholed, which might sound paradoxical, because I saw myself as a scholar on human resource, industrial relations. So I see myself as a social scientist then, and I still do now. The journals we tend to publish in aren't ethnic journals, aren't to do with race and ethnic. These aren't specialist migration journals. We publish in mainstream management, entrepreneurship, sociology, HRM journals deliberately. And that was always, so I fought against it. But in the year 2004, we were working in the East Midlands, and there's a development agency called East Midlands Development Agency, very proactive. They said, we appreciate your work. What we want you to do is to share it to the practitioner community. And that's quite rare. I said, well, that makes sense. So we decided to do that as a 2-year project because they funded us for 2 years. Mm-hmm. And then what we found was that there was an appetite for that amongst the practitioner community, and it's continued ever since wherever I've been. But I have to say, I have had that interest in engagement way before that. This year, I set up a conference in 1997, and this year is the 30th year of our annual Ethnic Minority Business Conference, which is remarkable in many ways. And at that conference, the aim of that conference is to get different communities who don't interact together. We get the banking community, we have business support communities, we've got minority entrepreneurs, and we've been doing it every year for 30 years. We have major policy announcements there. We've had ministers of small firms present, mayors, etc. And it's become a regular part of the calendar. So that
Can we get a bit
pre-existed.
of a shout out on that as well in terms of the dates and the venues so that people are aware as well?
Well, so it'll be we haven't decided the date. It'll probably be in November. But what we're going to be doing in this year is a whole suite of activities, because it's quite a milestone. Firms that have sort of spoken, entrepreneurs who have spoken at the conference, policy announcement. Lloyd's have been the sponsor for since 1997. So some of their experiences, what's changed over the last 3 decades. Soon we'll be doing a series of sort of marketing activity relating to all of that, but we'll announce the date pretty soon. It's likely to be in November.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, so so CREME now, as I said, now I think it's reasonably well known as a name. We're not a very big outfit, but we do have really impactful networks. One thing I'm really proud about is, we're at the center of a lot of entrepreneurs know us. They work with us. They like working with us. We work very closely with the banking sector. The government announced its small business strategy last year. We were mentioned 3 times as a delivery partner. That recognition is really pleasing. So is the fact that we're working with so many different diverse stakeholders.
Now, I want to shift a bit in terms of where we are going with this conversation, because we don't live in an isolated world as we can make out.
Yeah.
It's something which sits very close to my heart in terms of when we look at the migrant community and some of the issues they face. At least in my recent memory, there are a couple of events which has happened, which has really impacted me the way I look at entrepreneurship within this space. That brings me to the role of institutions and the trust amongst the institutions. So one of them would be the Windrush scandal, where we're talking about how people who've lived here for so long, they're suddenly facing that sort of legal uncertainty. And again, Brexit as well, which was another shift where industries, especially within the hospitality and retail sectors, like you mentioned earlier as well with your previous research, how they face labor shortages and some of the regulatory pressure.
Yeah, sure.
What do you think about some of these, how it has changed the environment, or how it is continuously changing that environment? And it's such a fast moving landscape with what's happening in and around us. How do we adjust when we are studying these group of individuals or their interaction with the institutions around them?
That is a challenging and important question, and it's going to be even more challenging and important over the coming years. We've touched obliquely on the nature of the wider context, the political context in the course of the discussion. And in Europe, one of the hottest topics, Europe in the world, one of the hottest topics is migration. And you can't have ignored the rightward shift of a lot of the discourse on migration, which was exacerbated by COVID, Brexit in particular in the UK case, and the whole issue of migration. And we've seen this across Europe, and issues that when I was kind of language, discourse that I thought was a thing of the past has now emerged quite strongly and in a worrying way. Terminology that's been used and would be seen as just unacceptable has just been normalized. And we see what's happening in the US and variations of that across Europe. And, if the political trends and polls are accurate, that is a trend that's going to be accentuated, not diminished. Yeah. And it does concern me. It does concern me. And for people who do the kind of work that we do, I actually paradoxically think it makes our work even more important. It makes it even more important to show how interwoven in the fabric of society we are. Migrants are, diverse communities are, how pivotal they are to a well-functioning society. Across Europe, this is a European issue. And I think doing it through the discourse of entrepreneurship has the potential to be quite a progressive response. I was in Germany, Munich, at an event looking at migrant integration in a city in Germany, city in Italy. And I was talking to a delegate at the event about precisely this issue, because in Germany there's a right of centre government and a very right of centre party that is very popular. And he said something very simple, but I think very persuasive. He said, whatever the political context, the work still needs to be done. And I think that's true. Our work still needs to be done. Our work of telling the story of people who make this society tick, providing opportunities for everyone to flourish, regardless of their background, sensitizing institutions of the value of all of us rather than a particular strand of society. It's never been so important. Getting close to the experiences of different communities has never been more important. We have a role to play in that. Absolutely. Universities have a really outsized important role to play in that. And I think the role of universities, and particularly on this agenda, has never been so important. We've got the ability to stand above the fray, to arbitrate amongst different claims on the basis of knowledge, not on the basis of political preference. That's really important. What that means in really simple terms is that people are making claims, but we have a role to say, look, okay, from our work, from our scholarship, this works in certain sciences, this doesn't, this stacks up, this doesn't. And our claim is legitimate because of our knowledge base. Very few people have that authority, and we should lean into that. And, in this era of fake news, what's real, etc., we still need to hold on to that. We need to hold on to that even more. So these are really challenging times, but there are grounds for optimism if we hold fast to those values of, I think, the original idea of a university, which is to open up a space for rational debate for all of us.
And I think what we can learn from you, of course, is how you bring, besides obviously making a huge contribution to the discipline in terms of how you bring people on the table. So my question, and again, I'm not putting you in a spot here, but my question to you would be, what are the issues, or how do we actually negotiate that storyline when we are actually trying to tell a real authentic story through our research work, which again, which interacts with the political environment, which interacts with the broader ecosystem in and around us? You mentioned about a few things there, but for scholars, how do they actually go about it? Because you want to bring everyone on the table. You don't want to, you don't want to upset anyone. You don't want to,
I think that's a really good question. I think in your question is the seeds of an answer. I think if you're going to tell a story effectively, you really need to know your audience. You need to know their pain points. You need to know their desires. You need to know their challenges. As academics, I'm not sure we test ourselves sufficiently. If you very parochial, mundane explanation, if we go to an academic conference or even a presentation in the academy, we'll say, here's the objectives, the hypothesis, the conceptualization, here's a method. So we're happy with ourselves because there's a sense of internal validity. No one cares. Your audience will bypass your audience, right? And I think we need to do more work.
Yeah.
Because I think, we are privileged. We are in a brilliant position because we have the knowledge base.
Yeah.
But we need to do more work to understand what's really important in what I'm articulating and how is that landing with our audience. If we're going to affect a change, right? Yeah. So we need to be much more accomplished and agile storytellers. Mm-hmm. So we need to make our message resonate, and we need to make them care by being very attentive and receptive to their needs. Yeah. We don't do that as academics.
We do that enough, yes.
We don't do that. And yet we have more persuasive and powerful ammunition than these sort of motivational speakers, etc., which is the story and nothing else. We should do it. We have the substance, but not the story. And we need to develop that art telling the story to different audiences. I could say now the Time to Change report, which is our main document.
Yeah.
The research is persuasive, but we've paid a lot of attention to communication, not through sophisticated glossy brochures or digital assets. It's by convening, bringing people together and being passionate and agile in communicating the message.
And this change in thinking, of course, like I said, you have been around and you've done some fabulous work. Have you noticed this shift, which I feel is generational? Because when you look at the new scholars, and again, this aligns to people we are studying as well. Because when you look at the numbers, the second and third generation entrepreneurs, they are moving into new sectors. So how is this evolving amongst the migrant entrepreneurship across generation as well? There's a difference in how they go about things, how they interact with people, how they bring people on the table, and again, how they work with them. So these structural, barriers which previous generation used to see is changing for them, or they're making those change happen.
I think it's changing dramatically. I think if you look at, I've told you about the contribution. If you do look at areas, the ones that we work in, I live in Birmingham, lots of areas in the UK and in other countries too. Migrants are at or near the forefront of a lot of emerging industries. Huge disproportionate migrants enter businesses and have patents, etc. They're at the forefront of a range of different activities. It's very skewed, the performance of different communities and entrepreneurs are very different, but nonetheless, it's a real phenomenon that we could harness better as a country. There are enduring challenges too, because, if you're from a migrant community, you're disproportionately likely to be at the bottom of the heap as well. There's a class dimension as well. But it is fast changing and evolving. And also the assets within this community, diasporic connections, it's becoming incredibly agile, diverse, and dynamic. And I think it's important for us to try and understand that and incorporate. That needs to be reflected in our thinking as well. So, in the work at our centre, we've got 2 or 3 significant projects on AI and the role in fashioning entrepreneurship. We're at the foothills of understanding the significance of that per se. And in our area, it's fascinating whether it's going to be a fast track way of levelling the field for minority communities, or it's just going to reproduce inequality. And that work needs to be done in understanding the impact of technology. But it's true, it's changing dramatically, and in a way that's exciting, and it's important for us to keep up with that.
Yeah. So, I don't know where the time is gone, and I'm just looking at it in terms of our discussion. But let me ask you a reflective question before we move on to the rapid fire, and then we'll close the session. I'd love to speak more about some of your work and how it has evolved. But again, you have spent so much time, in terms of the work you've done. And of course, you brought so much experience into this area, into this space through CREME, and of course your writing, the debates you've had. Let me ask you this: what has really surprised you the most about working in this space, especially how things have evolved over the last few years?
Well, I think there've been lots of different turning points. When I started, it was quite tough. There just wasn't the critical mass or thinking. It used to be, okay, so what's different about ethnic minority communities? And you had to go through rambling explanations about how important they were, etc., etc., etc. I think there've been turning points like George Floyd, existential issues like COVID, Brexit, which have had a disproportionate effect on minority communities. And I think people have seen visibly, inequality in its rawest form in some of those the challenges. And so I suppose that's led to an opening up. At the same time, it's led to really simplistic discourses that are, I think, quite hostile about migration, etc. And I've been surprised by both, really. The extent that the raw inequality that's been exposed by, say, Brexit or COVID, and the rawness and the virulence of the response, which is scapegoating migrants for all sorts of ills. I suppose in terms of an institutional perspective, that what we've seen is a sort of greater willingness to talk about inclusion and opportunity, but also with what's happening in the States, a backlash against that as well. So you've got this pendulum swinging both ways. And now I think we're in a sort of very precarious place. And it really invites us to think a lot more seriously about how we engage with the world as scholars. I think we have a really growing sense of responsibility to do so, to get involved in arenas where decisions are made, hugely consequential decisions are made, and present the facts in an engaging way. I think, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that continues to see, I continue to see that motivation across the work. And, you've inspired so many of us through your work. Now, let me take you through rapid fire, if that's okay. I've got a few one-word question, and this seems to be the flavor that way, but it'd be wonderful to get into your mind.
Yeah.
Just a few. Any book you'd recommend that has actually shaped your thinking?
One of my favorite books is a History of the World in 9.5 chapters by Julian Barnes. It's got nothing to do with the academy. I just got blown away by the quality of the writing. And I think there is something really quite moving when someone can write in a simple yet profound way. And I think as scholars, we should aspire to do that.
Moving on, the next one, around policy. What would you like to see if you had a magic wand, one policy which Britain actually needs?
Well, I mean, I'm going to be very parochial and boring, because I'll just apply it to the minority business area. And I think if we could just take data seriously, I think the figures we quote in our report are impressive, but we're just capturing a small amount of the contribution that we make. If we took data seriously at a governmental level in terms of capturing diversity and inclusion, I think it would be transformational for this agenda. It seems boring, but actually if we did that, I think it would be absolutely transformational in a positive way.
Yeah, and those who've heard you and seen your work or read your work, they would understand what you mean. No, this is very important. One last one. According to you, one thing which policymakers should listen to more.
Should listen to, again, this is going to be parochial and boring. I think they should listen to academics. Really do. I don't.
You're speaking for both of us.
They're really important. This is not just a minority business perspective. There's across the field. There's things are happening. Major policy decisions are being made that do not stack up against the evidence. And there was a move a few years ago about evidence-based policy making. It had its challenges, but it was the right direction. There is really, and I think it can bring people together. If you do it in a sensitive way, it can bring people together. Migration is a classic field, really. If you just banal example, I think irregular migration, the boats issue, it's a fraction of 1% in terms of how much it is. But popular opinion polls think it's nearly 50% of all migrants come that way. Yeah. And I think there's examples of that across the domain in our area as well.
Yeah, and I think that again, your appeal and your request that way, that we should be doing more and talk about a bit more. But Monder, thank you so much for this conversation. Clearly, your work, is so inspiring, and also it shows us in a lot of different ways how, businesses are built on high streets and neighborhoods across families. And I'd really implore, ask people to pick up your pieces, pick up your work, because these are the kind of stories which actually sustain local economies. And again, through your research, through your work at CREME, which is so important, you have again helped ensure those businesses are no longer just visible in academic and policy conversation. And that matters quite a lot, because the way we understand entrepreneurship actually shapes the kind of economy you and me build. So this has been Builders of the Broken Bazaar. I am Dr. Tabish Zaman. Until next time, keep questioning, keep listening, and keep building in this broken bazaar.